So our second reading is on page 974. We're continuing our little series in Matthew's Gospel. We began a couple of weeks ago. So we're up to Matthew chapter 2. We're into these sort of Christmas carol service readings. So we're looking at chapter 2, verses 1 to 12 today. And as usual, inside your service sheets is an outline of where we're going, and then dotted around are pens if you find it helpful to take notes. So Matthew 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, 'And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him.' After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." I'll do keep that open. The royal tour of Australia last week, it met with a pretty mixed response, as you probably picked up in the news. Some queued for hours in the heat just to get a glimpse of King Charles. One mum was there with her two little boys, and they were both wearing crowns and capes with fur trim and waving their flags. And crowds celebrated and they shouted, "God save the King!" At the other extreme, you had Senator Lydia Thorpe, who heckled him as he addressed Australia's Parliament House in Canberra, and she shouted her protest, didn't she, for about a minute before she was escorted away by security, yelling, "You are not my king! You are not my king!" And so also Wayne Wharton, arrested for shouting anti-monarchist slogans. And then you had plenty of people for whom the royal visit was a complete non-event. No interest whatsoever, total irrelevance, just enjoying the surf, or whatever people do in Australia. Well, in our Bible passage today, we encounter a similar range of response to King Jesus. Worship at one end of the spectrum, hatred and hostility at the other end of the spectrum, and apathy in between. And the question is, what is our response to him? That is the question this passage invites us to reflect on. And it matters. It matters because Jesus is not just some powerless figurehead over a few countries, but one with all authority over everyone. He is the King. So as he says in Matthew 28, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," given by God. So Jesus is the King God has appointed. So how we respond to this King, it really does matter. It will determine whether we are part of his kingdom. It will have consequences for us not just now, but in eternity. So when we get to, and it'll take a while till we get there, Matthew 25 in our series, Matthew chapter 25, King Jesus, he looks ahead to the day when he says he will judge the world. And he says that we will go away from that trial, either to eternal punishment or to eternal life. So a lot is at stake here. How we respond to Charles as king doesn't really matter. How we respond to Jesus as king, it really does. Well, what have we seen so far in Matthew's Gospel? The genealogy, chapter 1, it told us that Jesus is the son of Abraham, who would bring blessing to the world. And he's the son of David, who would rule the world. And then we saw last week that from a unique birth came a unique baby. So by virgin birth, we saw last week was born the Christ, King over us, Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus, the Saviour for us. And so far, the only response we've seen is that of Joseph. So Joseph believed God. He obeyed what God told him about the baby. But chapter 2 now is all about response. How will we respond to this king? And what responses should we expect to encounter in other people? Well, there are 3 here that you'll see on the sheet, which we can sum up as accept, reject, and neglect. So let's start with the positive, accept, the worship of the Magi. So verse 1, chapter 2, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, the wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, who were these guys? Our translation here says wise men. The Greek word is magoi, and hence other English translations have magi. It's actually an English word. I wasn't aware of that. You look it up in the dictionary. And magus, singular, or magi, plural, is defined as a member of a priestly caste in ancient Persia or sorcerers. So in the ancient world, magi were astrologers, sorcerers, magicians. They were into things like dreams and astrology and magic and the underworld. It's that kind of stuff. But we're not talking Mystic Meg with a crystal ball in a tent at the fairground. Okay, these were people of position and influence in the royal court. So, for example, they feature prominently in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Let me give you some examples. Daniel 2, verse 2. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers be summoned to tell the king his dreams. And then 2:27, Daniel says to the king, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery the king has asked. So that's who this group were in Matthew 2:1, who came to Jerusalem from the east, from Babylonia. One Christmas carol begins, we 3 kings of Orient are. Well, first, they weren't kings, okay? They may have come from the court as royal representatives, but they weren't kings themselves. So that's wrong. And secondly, we're not told that there were 3 of them. We 3 kings. We're not told there were 3. Doesn't say that. So in verse 11, they give 3 gifts, but that doesn't mean there was 3 of them. Maybe there were just 2 wise men. Maybe there were 5 and one of them was in charge of the gift department. I mean, we just don't know. We're not told. We need to sort of separate out tradition from biblical fact. But what we do know is that these guys were pagan astrologers from a long way away. And yet here they were in Jerusalem looking for the king. And that's significant because it highlights right from the outset, from his birth, that although Jesus in verse 2 is called the King of the Jews, he's also world king. So as the son of Abraham, blessing will come from him to the whole world. And all people everywhere need to become his disciples. Go and make disciples of all nations, Jesus will say, including pagan astrologers from Babylonia. That's who they were. Secondly, why did they come? Well, they came, verse 2, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. Now, the word for worship there, it doesn't necessarily mean that they saw this king as divine. It can just mean paying homage to a human dignitary. But it's still impressive. It's still very impressive that they came all this way to seek him, to worship him. What prompted them to come? Well, verse 2, they say, we saw his star. We saw his star. Now, we're not told exactly what that was. It may have been an alignment of planets. It may have been a supernova, a faint star that violently explodes. It may have been a comet. We're not told. But these guys were astrologers, they were stargazers, and they saw something that they interpreted as a special king has been born. And so they set out to find him. They may well have had an expectation of a king coming from Jewish books. So there was a large Jewish community in Babylonia. So perhaps these wise men, maybe they knew Numbers 24:17 in the Old Testament. In this Old Testament verse, Balaam, who was from the eastern mountains, he prophesies this. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Maybe they knew that. But anyway, they set out from Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Well, they set out for Jerusalem. Why for Jerusalem? Because it was the Jewish capital. So the star didn't guide them to Jerusalem. But when they got there, the star reappears in verse 9, and it guides them to the exact location of the child. So that bit was clearly miraculous. That was a sort of supernatural guidance, sort of ancient GPS locator from God. Now, if you go on Google Maps and you stick in Baghdad to Jerusalem, it comes up at 1,090 kilometers. 1,090 kilometers. Now, even if we assume they were on camels, and we're not told that, but let's assume that, the journey would have taken several months. So when Ezra made the trip from Babylon to Jerusalem, Ezra 7 verse 9, it took him 4 months. So if the wise men left home when the star appeared, signaling that the child had been born, it just happened, the wise men definitely were not there with the shepherds at the manger. Okay, despite what we see on Christmas cards and in nativity sets and so on, they definitely weren't there together. But the point is, it is a very long and costly journey to make. Leaving behind home, family, friends, their work, leaving everything to worship the King. T.S. Eliot wrote a powerful poem called The Journey of the Magi, and he imagines the journey from the point of view of one of the wise men. The night fires going out, the lack of shelters, and the city's hostile and the town's unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices, a hard time we had of it. He says there were times we regretted the summer palaces on the slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. That's wonderful stuff. And their difficult journey is a challenge to us. How committed are we to seeking the truth? How far will we journey to find the truth? When we get to chapter 7, verse 7, Jesus will say, seek, and you will find. And the wise men here are an example of that. If we seek the truth, we will find it. But that seeking takes effort, and it may be costly in time. It may involve sacrifice. Are we prepared for that? Nabil Qureshi was a devout Muslim who eventually came to worship Jesus as the king. But it was a long journey, very costly journey for him. And he's written a book about it called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Seek, and you will find. Maybe you're not a Christian at the moment, but you've come along today because you're curious. Maybe you saw a sign in the night sky. Not a star, but the illuminated cross on top of the barge. Or maybe a Christian friend has been talking to you. And that's fantastic. Follow the signs. Keep seeking. Take the next step on the journey. Be determined to seek the truth and to find out more about Jesus. And if we are Christian, how determined are we to worship the King? How much effort are we prepared to make? To make time to read His Word and to pray, to meet regularly with His people, to grow in the truth. Why bother? Well, because of what the wise men found at journey's end. And that's our third point there. What did they do? Well, Three things. They rejoiced. Firstly, verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. So at the end of their long journey was joy, great joy, when they found what they had been looking for. And that is what God promises us, that the birth of the Christ is good news of great joy, as the angel says in Luke's account. Where are you seeking joy at the moment in life? And people are looking for joy in all sorts of places, aren't they? In relationships, in work, in money, in gambling, in drink, in drugs, in pornography. And true joy is found in coming to this King, that they rejoiced. Secondly, they worshipped. Verse 11, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. They fell down, they worshipped him. Notice they just worshipped him, not Mary. They worshipped him as the King. And that's how we're to respond to him. To bow down, to worship as they did. But worship now in the fullest sense as God, given we know that he is Emmanuel, God with us. They rejoiced, they worshipped, and they gave. Verse 11, then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Is there significance in the different gifts? Some people say gold for a king, incense for divinity, myrrh for suffering. It's a stretch. It's a big stretch. Certainly was way beyond anything the wise men would have known. The point is rather simply, as Callum was saying at the beginning, that they were costly gifts fit for a king. Do you remember, it's what the Queen of Sheba did back in 1 Kings 10. Do you remember she came to visit King Solomon, the son of David, who foreshadows King Jesus. And what did she do? She came and gave him gold and spices and precious stones. We had it in Psalm 72 about King Solomon, that it foresaw him having global rule, the kings of the world falling down before him and bringing precious gifts. So these Old Testament patterns are fulfilled in the visit of the wise men to the ultimate king. And they picture what our response should be as well. To offer Jesus gifts fit for a king, fit for the king. So not just tossing him the leftovers of our time and money and energy, but giving him our treasures, fit for a king. So the very best of our abilities in serving him, our resources, our money, our time, our whole lives, all offered to him. So not just sort of throwing him the tack that falls out of a Christmas cracker, but costly gifts fit for a king. As one song says, all that I am, I lay before you. So that's the first response, the model response to accept Jesus as king, the worship of the wise men. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have rejection, the hostility of Herod. Firstly, who was he? So verse 1, in the days of Herod the king. Herod was born in 73 BC. He was named king of Judea in 40 BC by the Roman Senate. And within 3 years, he had crushed all opposition to his rule. He loved power and he was paranoid. So when these wise men arrive in Jerusalem saying, oh, where is he who's been born king of the Jews? We've come to worship him. How did Herod respond? Well, he was not happy. Not at all. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod was troubled because another king of the Jews was a threat to him. Especially if this other king was a descendant of David, because Herod himself wasn't. He was just an Edomite. He was appointed by Rome. And his later years were plagued by fear of rivals. Herod's paranoia led to jealousy and fits of rage. And that is why we read that all Jerusalem was troubled too. Because they knew what Herod was capable of. Herod ended up killing not just his close associates, but also his wife and at least 2 of his sons. When Herod got mad, he was a very loose cannon, and nobody was safe. So Herod was troubled, and so in verses 4 to 6, he finds out from the religious leaders which town this king has been born in. And he then, in verses 7 to 8, he dispatches the wise men to find which house this child is in, claiming that I too may come and worship him. Blatant lie. His real intention was to kill him, to destroy this rival king, as is clear when we get down to verse 13 next time. Now, Herod's hostility to Jesus, Herod's hatred of Jesus, has been played out many times since in church history, in violent persecution of Jesus' people, destroying churches, burning Bibles, killing Christians. But the truth is that there is something of Herod in all of us. The essence of sin, the Bible tells us, is that I want to be king. I want to run my own show, my life, my rules. And so this news that another king has been born, the rightful king, the king appointed by God, it troubles us. Our sinful nature sees Jesus as a rival, as a threat, because we want to be king. And so we want to get rid of him. We want to silence him. What can hold us back from becoming Christians is not just that we don't believe it's true, but that we don't want to give up self-rule. We don't want this other king telling us what to do with our time and our money and our sexuality and our ambitions and our life. And so we shout, "You are not my king." But if Jesus is the king appointed by God, saying he's not my king is not very clever, because it puts me on a collision course with the true king when he returns to rule. Now, a way some people try to get around this is by treating Jesus just as rescuer but not as ruler. So to treat him like a sort of heavenly hole in the wall, dispensing not cash but forgiveness. But that's not true Christianity. In Acts 17:7, the message the early Christians were proclaiming is summed up as, they're saying there is another king, Jesus. That's the real deal. That's true Christianity. So being disciples of Jesus means submitting to his rule, obeying his commands. It means repenting of self-rule. So the responses we've seen so far are accept the worship of the wise men, reject the hostility of Herod, and third, neglect the apathy of the religious leaders. And this is perhaps the biggest surprise of all. Verse 4. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he, Herod, inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And they then quote freely from Micah, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. The Old Testament scriptures foretold where the Christ, the King, would be born, in Bethlehem. And there were two Bethlehems, so the prophecy specified which Bethlehem it was, the one in Judah. And the religious leaders knew this. So when Herod asked them where the Christ was to be born, they immediately quote this passage. They knew the king was coming. They knew which town he'd be born in. And wise men arrived from the east saying, the king has now been born. And everyone in Jerusalem is talking about it. So what do these religious leaders do? Nothing. Nothing at all. Bethlehem is 5 miles down the road. They don't even go to look. They don't check it out. They're not interested. They couldn't be bothered. They just stay in and watch Judea's Got Talent or whatever was on. Such spiritual privilege, and yet such apathy. But what have we done with the spiritual privilege, with the light that we have had? We live in a country with a strong Christian heritage, with churches everywhere, with Bibles in our own language, with freedom to follow Christ. Like those religious leaders, we have had such spiritual privilege compared to others in other places and at other times. But what have we done with it? What have we done with the light that we've had? So many people are just apathetic, aren't they, about King Jesus? Indifferent, couldn't be bothered. And some of us were even taken to church as children, and we went to Sunday school, and we were brought up in Christian homes. But now, not interested. We went knocking on some doors in the local area last week to speak to people about Jesus, to invite them to come to church. One guy spoke about how he'd been taken to church as a child, but he wasn't interested in Jesus now, not at all. And we said, what are you interested in? Football. And he speaks for many. Jesus, nah, not interested, mate. Not my thing. Matthew's first readers would have been shocked and shamed by the contrast here. Pagan astrologers travel over 1,000 kilometers to worship King Jesus just because of a sign in the night sky. And by contrast, the religious Jewish leaders, they had the scriptures, they knew it like the back of their hands, they had Bethlehem on the doorstep, but they just weren't interested. And at the final judgment, the wise men will rise up and condemn them, and condemn many in our country too, and maybe even some of us. It's possible to attend church even regularly, but to have the same attitude to Jesus as these religious leaders, that we couldn't be bothered. He makes no difference at all to our lives in the rest of the week. Like them, we may have impressive Bible knowledge, we know the right answers, but we're just not interested in being disciples. Head knowledge, but hearts far from him. That inwardly we're saying, you're not my king. Why did these religious leaders respond this way? What was going on? It becomes apparent as the account unfolds that basically they thought they were good enough for God as they were without Jesus, and they didn't need someone who would save his people from their sins, as we saw last week. And they actually found it offensive to be told that they did need such a person. Duchess of Buckingham, we've quoted before, she was this high society lady, 18th century England. She heard the preaching of the Wesleys and Whitfield, and she wrote to the Countess of Huntingdon in outrage. She said, "It is monstrous to be told that you have a heart as sinful as the common wretches that crawl upon the earth." And that attitude, that is something we need to be aware of. That spirit of self-righteousness which thinks we're good enough as we are. And that self-righteousness quickly develops into hostility to Jesus. So by the time we get to chapter 12, verse 14, these religious leaders are plotting to destroy Jesus, to kill him, just like Herod. So 3 responses to King Jesus: to accept, to reject, to neglect. Which do we identify with most closely at the moment? So are we like the wise men, making every effort to seek the truth and joyfully worshipping the King and giving our all to him? Or are we like Herod? Do we see Jesus as a rival, as a threat, wanting to run life my own way? Or are we like the religious leaders, with such spiritual privilege, but just not bothered? Which hat best fits at the moment, and what is our direction of travel? And that's really important. That matters as well. Not just where are we now, but what is our direction of travel? Because it may be that you have been hostile like Herod, but you're moving away from that towards worship. So 2 years ago, a friend of mine was pretty hostile to Christian faith, dismissive of Jesus, but we caught up a few weeks ago. And it's clear that he's been on the move towards Jesus. And he's not worshipping yet, but he's on a journey in that direction. And that's fantastic. That's great. Conversely, we may be a worshipper, but the direction of travel is away from that. So we may be aware that in our heart we're becoming apathetic. We're becoming cold. Jesus warns later in Matthew's account in chapter 24, verse 12, He warns of coming days when he said, the love of many will grow cold. And so we need to beware of sort of creeping indifference. Can't be bothered anymore with being a disciple. Too much effort. Lost interest. More into other things now. Or maybe a sort of a hardening against Jesus as king because we're resisting and we're resenting his rule in some area of life. Something we don't want to give up, something we don't want to change. Now, if so, it is very, very important to address this. To share our struggle with a Christian friend, ask for their help, their support, to come back to being true worshippers who treat Jesus as the great king that he is. You'll have seen in the news the sad story of Sir Chris Hoy, cycling superstar, 6 Olympic gold medals, who just announced that he's got stage 4 cancer. It's terminal. He's been given 2 to 4 years. So sad, only 48 years old. And yet, as he says, we're all born, we all die, and this is just part of the process. And we were thinking about that, weren't we, in the talk last week. And he's written a book which is coming out next month about the challenge of his cancer diagnosis. And the title of the book is All That Matters. All That Matters. Facing death does focus the mind on what matters in life. But what is that? So what is the all that matters? Now, I don't know what he'll say in the book. It hasn't come out yet. But how we respond to Jesus, the king that God has appointed, it is what matters most. And that is why Matthew has put it front and center so early on in his gospel account here in chapter 2. And it should be the top of the list of what matters for Sir Chris, but also for all of us too. Well, let's take a moment to reflect in the quiet, and then we're going to join in prayer together.